At 3 a.m., Karen, the HOA president, stood ankle-deep in muddy water, screaming into her phone as her Lexus floated gracefully into a neighbor's garden. Sirens wailed, sprinklers sparked, and fruit trees snapped like twigs in the current. All I could think was, I warned them, but they dug that trench. They destroyed my orchard. So, I gave them exactly what they asked for, and a little more. You're probably wondering how we got here. Let me take you back a few months, to when my life was still green and peaceful, literally. My backyard was my sanctuary. I lived just outside a neighborhood ruled by an overzealous homeowners association. Thankfully, my little slice of paradise sits beyond their jurisdiction, legally speaking. I built my home with a modest budget and an even humbler ego, nestled on a patch of unincorporated land that bordered their cookie-cutter utopia. And on that land, I planted an orchard, pear trees, plums, figs, and a stubborn little apple tree that never quite thrived but never stopped trying. That orchard wasn't just a hobby, it was therapy. It was legacy. And apparently, it was an eyesore, according to a woman with a clipboard and a superiority complex. Enter Karen, yes, her real name. I know, it sounds like a bad script. Karen, the HOA president, had a permanent squint, as if sunlight and bad taste personally offended her. She'd never introduced herself, but she had no problem stuffing HOA newsletters into my mailbox, technically illegal, technically adorable. Most of the time, I ignored her, and she returned the favor, until the great puddle. A particularly rainy February left a low-lying corner of their subdivision waterlogged. Anyone with half a brain could see it was poor grading and a lousy drainage slope in their own backyard design. But instead of fixing their engineering blunder, the HOA board, Karen and her equally power-hungry sidekick, Dave from Lot 12, decided to blame me. Or, more specifically, my orchard's irrigation system. Apparently, my trees were somehow responsible for increased groundwater retention, which translated to, there's a puddle in Susan's yard. I found out about this from a passive-aggressive email Karen sent, not to me, but to the neighborhood Google group, with my address bolded and in all caps, contributing non-compliant water flow source. I'm not making this up. Who talks like that? I laughed at first. Then came the trench. One morning, I walked out with my coffee and found a backhoe parked half on my property. Men in high-vis vests were digging a narrow trench along the shared property line. It ran straight into the corner of my orchard, slicing through roots like butter. I yelled at them to stop. They shrugged, said they were hired by the HOA, something about improving runoff drainage. I told them to leave immediately. They didn't. 2 of my plum trees were practically sheared in half. A fig tree leaned like it had been sucker-punched. The soil, carefully tended over 5 years, was torn up like a battlefield. I stormed over to Karen's house, fists clenched, phone camera rolling. She opened the door with a practiced smirk and a glass of Chardonnay. I asked her politely, at first, why her contractors had trespassed and destroyed my property. She said it was necessary maintenance for the neighborhood's benefit. I asked when I'd given permission for a trench through my orchard. She said, "Oh, don't be dramatic. It's just landscaping." I stared at her. "You killed my figs for landscaping?" She sipped her wine. "They're just trees." At that moment, I knew 2 things: 1, Karen had no soul, and 2, this was going to get ugly. I tried the legal route first. I documented everything, took videos, called my insurance, hired a lawyer. He was polite, competent, and utterly useless. Apparently, the trench was technically just outside the boundary where I could claim significant damages. Suing would cost more than I'd ever recover, and the HOA, surprise, surprise, had a legal team on retainer. Unless I wanted to spend the next 5 years in court arguing about root encroachment, I was out of luck. Meanwhile, the HOA wasn't done. They started sending me notices, claiming I was now directing water toward their neighborhood on purpose. That my irrigation setup, which had existed for half a decade without complaint, was suddenly a malicious water management system. Their words, malicious. Like I had some Bond villain lair pumping groundwater into their community for fun. They gave me 30 days to remove my non-compliant irrigation structure. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. There is no irrigation structure. It's a hose and gravity. Still, the damage to the orchard worsened. The trench, open and poorly reinforced, caused more erosion during the next rainfall. 5 trees showed signs of stress. One of my pear trees collapsed entirely after a bad storm. When I showed up to an HOA meeting to confront them, they told me I was trespassing. It was a members-only session. Karen had security, yes, actual security, escort me off the property. Clipboards, smug glances, and all. That's when something in me snapped. Not in the lose-my-mind way, but in the cold, calculated way. The kind of snap that says, fine, you want a flood? Let's make it rain, The final straw wasn't the trench or the dead trees or even being accused of eco-terrorism via hose pipe. It was when I came home one afternoon and found a brand new concrete drainage pipe running through my back fence. Not next to, not along, through. Someone had cut through my fence, installed a pipe straight into my orchard, and sealed it like it had always been there. No note, no permission, no explanation. That night, I stood in the dark with a flashlight, staring at the pipe, humming like a villain in Act 2. They thought they could funnel their water problem into my land like it was a trash can. They thought I'd just accept it, like they'd claimed a new piece of territory, HOA manifest destiny. And that's when I decided, they built the trench, they pointed the water at me, but what happens when the water changes direction? What happens when the orchard fights back? Let's just say physics is a beautiful thing. I spent the next week researching things I never thought I'd need to know, municipal water flow codes, soil permeability rates, and how liability is determined when water goes where it shouldn't. Turns out, there's a whole world of legal gray areas when it comes to runoff. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized how much the HOA had overplayed their hand. The trench they'd carved through my orchard wasn't just rude, it was a clear violation of easement laws. Proving that in court would cost more than my truck, and dragging it through the system would mean years of stress and petty countersuits. And knowing Karen, she'd treat every court date like a fashion show. I called my lawyer again, just to be sure. He gave me the same shrug over the phone answer, technically, you have a case, but they'll delay, countersue, and bury you in HOA bylaws. You'd be out $10,000 before they blink. I thanked him and hung up. Then I looked out my window at the shattered remains of my best plum tree. That tree had given me fruit for 6 seasons. It was the first thing I'd planted after building the house. Now, it looked like someone had blown out its roots with dynamite. I tried reasoning again, because apparently, I still had a scrap of optimism buried under all the sarcasm. I emailed the HOA with a formal complaint, complete with photos, a timeline of damage, and quotes from local contractors estimating repair costs. The response? A form letter signed by Karen, stating the HOA was committed to community excellence and would investigate internally. I could almost hear her smirking through the screen. 2 days later, a fresh notice was taped to my front door, literally taped, like a teenager breaking up with you after prom. It accused me of violating water management ordinances and claimed my property was now the likely source of worsening flood risk in adjacent parcels. Translation: they destroyed my land and blamed me for the mess they created. That's when the pettiness began. HOA members I'd never met started glaring when they walked past my house. Someone left a nasty note in my mailbox about selfish landowners ruining property values. One neighbor, who used to wave every morning, just turned and walked the other way. It was like being cast as the villain in a movie I hadn't auditioned for. I wouldn't have been surprised if Karen handed out pitchforks at the next board meeting. They weren't done. Karen was just getting started. One morning, I woke up to the sound of power tools and found a concrete drainage pipe being installed, this time without subtlety. A hired crew, under HOA orders, was expanding their trench into a full-blown stormwater solution, pouring concrete and rebar into a channel that now clearly crossed into my land. I confronted the crew. They said they had permits. I asked to see them. They shrugged. One guy offered me a donut and said he just did what he was told. The real kicker. When I went to City Hall to raise hell, I was told the permit application had listed the area as community common space, which, of course, it wasn't. It was my land. But the application had been rubber-stamped by someone who didn't bother to check the parcel map. Bureaucracy at its finest. I filed a formal dispute that same day, but I knew it would be weeks before anyone read it. By then, the orchard was down nearly half its trees. The trench was eroding soil faster than I could stabilize it. Even the birds that used to perch on the fig branches seemed to have moved on. I felt like I was watching a part of my life being erased, one tree at a time. And I was supposed to smile and nod while the HOA handed me the shovel. So, I stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. I called an old college buddy, Eli, a civil engineer with a dry sense of humor and a knack for solving petty problems with elegant solutions. I explained everything to him, down to the trench, the destroyed orchard, the concrete pipe, and Karen's smug face. After a long pause, he said, "You know, if they're going to use gravity against you, there's no reason you can't return the favor." It was the most beautiful sentence I'd heard in weeks.